Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're diving into the 7th and hopefully final episode on the JonBenèt Ramsey case. This week, we're going to be going over a lot of different theories, a lot of different suspects, a lot of different thoughts. So if you haven't already, then I would highly suggest that you go back and listen to the last 6 parts on this series, or else this episode may not make a whole lot of sense to you. Now, before I say let's get it, and before we go any further, I want to give the biggest, happiest, best birthday shout out to Kay Jones, because rumor on the street is it's your birthday week. So Lacey wanted to wish you a happy birthday on y'all's favorite podcast, and that's easy enough for me to do. So happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday. Thank y'all so much for being such avid listeners and always being so supportive, even from real early on. I love it so much. And with all that being said, and without further ado, let's get it. So this week I wanted to just go over some of the theories that float around with this case, because there are theories for days. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of different theories and multiple suspects and so many different things that people think happened to JonBenèt and why they think they happened, where they think they happened, etc., etc. So I just want to go over some of the most popular theories and then some of the ones that you may never have even heard of. So let's jump right into the theories, because y'all are most definitely going to want to listen to the end. I had a listener send in a theory that blew my entire ass off. And just trust me when I say that you're going to want to hear this. So, for starters, let's start with what I feel like, in my opinion, is probably one of the top 3 theories about what could have possibly happened to JonBenèt and who could have done it. And that would bring us right to the Patsy Did It camp. So, these are the people who believe that Patsy Ramsey murdered JonBenèt, whether accidentally or on purpose. So the accidental Patsy Did It camp typically go with the theory that JonBenèt wet the bed, and that since this was something that was happening almost every night, that on this night, for whatever reason, that the bedwetting on this night sent Patsy into a fit of rage. And I can kind of see this theory being plausible, except for 3 things: the garrote, the sexual assault, and the stun gun or laser marks. But let's actually talk this theory through, because this was one of those theories that Boulder Police Department were working on during the investigation into JonBenèt's case. And the thinking behind this theory is that Patsy accidentally killed JonBenèt because of the bedwetting issue. And that after Patsy realized that she'd gone too far and that JonBenèt was actually dead, that's when Patsy decided to stage the house to look like a kidnapping for ransom just to cover the crime up. And let's just nip this bedwetting thing in the ass real quick, because people will often say like, oh, kids who are abused physically or sexually are the only ones that wet the bed. That's just not true. There are a number of things that people like to point to as the reason that JonBenèt would be wetting the bed every night. And they say that being a pageant girl was so stressful, and that since JonBenèt was always so stressed, that was a reason that she wet the bed every night. It's also often said that kids who are sexually abused or kids who live in like a bad home environment are also kids that wet the bed. And in reality, there are a plethora of other reasons that kids JonBenèt's age wet the bed every single night. I'll even give you some of the very normal, very likely reasons for bedwetting between the ages of 4 to 6 year old, because they include the fact that this child may still be working on nighttime bladder control. There's also a possibility that this child may be suffering from a urinary tract infection or UTI. Another super normal reason why kids ages 4 to 6 may still wet the bed, or just that the child may have a small bladder. That's not unheard of. But the most common reason that kids this age still wet the bed is actually pretty simple, and it's usually due to an issue of like ongoing constipation. And I'm taking this next sentence straight from the Mayo Clinic website, because it says, quote, "A child who is constipated does not have bowel movements often enough, and the stool may become hard and dry. When constipation is long-term, the muscles involved in passing urine and stools may not work well, and this can be linked to bedwetting." Now, I'm aware that a lot of people think that JonBenèt's bedwetting was due to sexual abuse, especially after it was found during her autopsy. But the 3 reasons I just can't get behind this theory are pretty simple. If Patsy flipped out and accidentally killed JonBenét because she wet the bed, then fine. They could easily cover this murder up. Patsy could have allegedly told police that she put JonBenét in the tub to clean her up after she'd wet the bed. And Patsy could have said that she walked out of the bathroom for a few minutes, maybe to get a new set of sheets, to change the bed, what have you. And that when she came back into the bathroom, that she saw that JonBenét had slipped and fallen and hit her head on the side of the tub. And bam. That would really be all that Patsy would need to say if she had accidentally killed JonBenét by hitting her on the head. Whether that was she pushed her, shoved her, and JonBenét hit her head on the sink. Whatever the case may be, that would really be all that Patsy would need to say. But then why would Patsy go so far as to tie a garrote around JonBenét's neck and then take it a step further and sexually assault JonBenét? And then hit her already dead 6-year-old with a stun gun or a taser? I don't know. Those are the reasons I just can't get in the Patsy Did It camp. Those things have never made much sense. Like, I could see freaking out after she realized that she just killed her kid over wetting the bed. But all the extra stuff, that just gets so graphic, I just can't see her taking it that far. And most of the other stuff would be so unnecessary. Because like I said, all she would have to do was come up with something to tell police, and she could have left JonBenét's body in the bathroom if that's where it happened. Or she could have left her body anywhere else in the house, wherever the crime may have happened. And I'm not trying to make this seem so nonchalant, like, whoop, she killed her kid and staged the rest. I'm not saying it like that. I'm saying if Patsy had possibly pushed or shoved JonBenét into the bathroom, and that maybe JonBenét hit her head on something, maybe Patsy didn't realize how hard she pushed her, and then she sees JonBenét laying on the floor, she doesn't realize how hard she'd hit her, and she could have possibly hit her tub on the toilet, the shower, the tub, like whatever. But Patsy wouldn't have to have gone so far as to use a garrote and then sexually abuse her daughter with the end of a paintbrush handle. And then we're forgetting that she would have also had to have wrote a 2.5-page long ransom note to make all of this look like an intruder did it. I don't know, I guess anything's possible, but for me, the sexual assault and the garrote make this kind of hard for me to think that there's no way a mother could do this to her child. But then in that same breath, I can think of literally hundreds of cases where moms do in fact do this to their kids. Something else, though, is that the skull fracture wouldn't have been something that Patsy or John would have been able to see with their naked eye. The skull fracture wasn't found until the autopsy was done. So it's possible that if JonBenét was shoved or pushed, and that she hit her head, that she would have likely been unconscious but not dead. So maybe that explains the garrote and the sexual assault and the long-ass ransom note? But then to believe this theory, you would have to believe that Patsy saw her 6-year-old daughter unconscious and didn't even check to see if she could do CPR, if she still had a pulse or a heartbeat, or... I mean, you would have to believe that Patsy sees JonBenét unconscious on the ground, that she immediately goes to herself and says, yep, this kid's dead. Now what? Without even checking, that's what you would have to believe. Honestly, I don't know. And the police even asked Patsy about JonBenét's death possibly being the result of an accident. Like, the police legit just asked Patsy, hey, what if JonBenét wet the bed and you were just fed up and so over it, and something happened accidentally that was the result of JonBenét's death? And Patsy, of course, got kind of angry, kind of defensive, and kind of emotional when they asked her this. Patsy's voice gets noticeably irritated, and she even kind of smacks her hand down on the table when she's talking to the officers, and she's just like telling them, like, you are out of your mind. And some people point to Patsy being upset by this line of questioning, and they said, like, oh, see, that's just another example of how Patsy isn't in control of her emotions and her anger. And it seems like they do this to kind of try to validate what they believe happened to JonBenét. But then let's try to play devil's advocate here for a minute, and if I'm putting myself in Patsy's shoes for even a second here, I'm thinking if Patsy didn't have anything to do with JonBenét's death, then I could totally see why that she would be upset and angry and emotional with this line of questioning. Like, her kid was killed, and if she didn't do it, then why are the police even wasting their time questioning her? I could see her thinking about it like that. I can see why people point to Patsy being irritated and pissed, and then using that to say that Patsy doesn't have control of her anger or emotions. But then I can also see why Patsy would be acting like that if she were innocent. So I do try to see it from both sides to kind of see, like, what I would do and think in both situations. And then I also think it's important to mention it here with the Patsy Did It camp of theories that JonBenèt's bedding was not wet. It also didn't have stains that would have come from the bed getting wet. And there were also no signs that the sheets had been changed, so I feel like this kind of throws that theory out the window, unless you have some other way that the bed was dry and the sheets hadn't been changed, but JonBenèt wet the bed still. If so, I don't know what to say about that. I've never seen anything that says that the sheets were found in the washing machine or the dryer or in the trash like Chris Watts' dumbass did. And there were also fibers from the rope that were found on JonBenèt's body that were also in her bed. Which, that just kind of further makes me believe that the sheets hadn't been changed that night, which again, like I said, just kind of throws this whole accidental murder because of bedwetting out the water. And then JonBenèt's pajama bottoms weren't even wet or urine stained, so if this were some masterminded cover-up, where Patsy thought about all these other factors to stage this crime scene to look like an intruder came into the Ramsey house and then murdered JonBenèt, then why wouldn't she remember to change the pajama pants too? But then again, some people take the fact that JonBenèt did have urine on her pajama pants and they say, well, she obviously wet the bed because her pajama bottoms had urine on them. But that's kind of something we've already talked about because, of course, her pajamas would have been urine stained. They would have had urine on them because everyone's body releases its stools, urines, and toxins once we pass away. So the urine could be from when JonBenèt passed away and her body released all of the normal natural things like urine and stool and etc. But in my head, I can't make this theory work to save my life. It doesn't help that DNA ruled Patsy Ramsey out. So as far as DNA goes, Patsy's been cleared. And even though DNA has cleared Patsy, there's still the ransom note and the amount of people who have analyzed this ransom note and Patsy's handwriting. It's almost like the verdict of whether or not specialists and experts believe that the note matches Patsy's handwriting or not. You have to really look into their qualifications and their credentials, but it's kind of split down the middle between yes, we think Patsy wrote the note, and no, we don't think she wrote the note. And this is coming from someone who, up until super recently, had always gone back and forth between the theory that someone in the house had to have been the one responsible, to now I'm not sure what I even think happened. What I do know is if there's one case that I could choose to solve, it would be this case, hands down. Even though I think even if it ever does get solved, I still feel like people are still going to point at the Ramsey family and say, guilty, guilty, guilty. Like, even if John, Patsy, and Burke were all completely ruled out, I still think that people would point the finger at them. And speaking of Burke, he was never named a suspect or even a person of interest by the Boulder Police Department in this case. But of course that doesn't stop the rumor mill and the theory wagon from rolling out theory after theory after theory on how JonBenèt was possibly murdered by her 9-year-old brother. But before we dive into the main theory of how Burke supposedly murdered his sister, I want to touch on the fact that when Burke was younger and he was interviewed, and he was asked to draw a picture of his family, I have been thinking about this since last week, and of course he wouldn't have drawn JonBenèt into the family picture that he was drawing. It had literally been burned into his brain and forced down his throat that his sister was dead. He wouldn't need to forget or remember because he would have been reminded of it constantly, so it never would have made it to the back of his mind. So obviously, he wouldn't have drawn her in the picture. That's all he's heard for months or years is JonBenèt was kidnapped. JonBenèt was killed. No, she wasn't kidnapped, but she was killed. Constant rotation of reminding him that his sister is dead. He would not draw her for that reason, I feel like. But let's continue, because of course there's this pineapple theory that Burke was eating pineapple and milk as a midnight snack, that JonBenèt snuck or stole a piece or somehow pissed Burke off, and he killed her in this rage-filled temper tantrum, allegedly. But according to experts that were brought into this CBS special that we talked about last week, The most obvious problem with this theory is that Burke wouldn't have been able to hide the body in the basement, make a garrote, tie an intricate knot, tape and tie JonBenèt's body up, and then write a 2.5-page ransom note with words like attaché in it all by himself. So from here, the theory goes that John and Patsy freaked out when they learned what had happened and that they helped Burke do all of this staging so that they wouldn't lose both of their kids in one night. Because if JonBenèt was dead and Burke was charged and convicted with the murder of JonBenèt, then they would have been left with no more kids in the house with John and Patsy. Because, of course, John Ramsey had older adult-aged kids with his first wife, but JonBenèt and Burke would have been the only 2 kids still left in the house. So the theory goes that John and Patsy helped stage this murder all in the sake of saving Burke. But in all actuality, if we really step back and look at the evidence that was used to make this entire theory a theory at all, it essentially all boils down to this damn bowl of pineapple. The bowl had Burke's fingerprints on it, but it did not have JonBenèt's fingerprints on it anywhere. So the CBS special speculated that maybe JonBenèt came downstairs while Burke was eating this pineapple and milk, and that she grabbed a piece of pineapple out of the bowl with her fingers instead of using the spoon. The experts in this CBS series then claimed that this would explain why JonBenèt's fingerprints weren't on the bowl anywhere. But that's also a lot of assumption. We're assuming that she stole a piece of pineapple. We're assuming that if she actually did that, that she did it with her fingers and not the spoon. We're making a lot of assumptions. You know what they say about assumptions, right? Makes an ass out of you and me? Yeah? Okay. Now, also in this CBS series, the experts speculate again that the huge Maglite flashlight that was found on the kitchen counter of the Ramsey house on the morning after JonBenèt's body was discovered in the basement, they claim that this flashlight could have been the cause of the skull fracture. So the experts at CBS on this series, they try to make it out like this flashlight was the instrument used to cause the skull fracture. Which, I'll give them this part. They did do some testing and they were like recreating the scene, and they used some of the same things like the flashlight found in the Ramsey house. They also used this flashlight to hit a human-sized, like 6-year-old sized mannequin head. And the head wound that was found on the mannequin head is similar to the skull fracture that was found during JonBenèt's autopsy. But again, no one in the Ramsey house supposedly knows where this flashlight even came from. None of the Ramseys have even ever seen this flashlight in their house before. And like I've already mentioned, there weren't any fingerprints found on the flashlight anywhere. Not on the handle, not on the top, not on the batteries that were inside of it. There's literally no evidence that could be pulled from this flashlight and tested. And then let's also not forget the part where everybody in the Ramsey house says that they did not make a bowl of pineapple and milk. So the pineapple and milk and the Maglite flashlight were 2 pieces of evidence that the Ramseys claim they did not put there. And there's not really any evidence that proves that they're lying. So there's another thing to keep in mind if you're in the camp that quote-unquote Burke did it. I also want to throw it out here and just mention it. If you've never looked into this case and you only watch this CBS series about it on this case, that's all the research you do, then you probably will leave thinking that Burke did it too. And that's simply because the way that this series was laid out, they recreated damn near every event, and you can tell that they spent a lot of money and time on filming this series. But you also have to remember other key pieces of evidence too. So if you only ever watch this CBS special on JonBenèt's case, then I would just highly suggest digging a little deeper into this case, doing a little bit of your own research, and you'll start to see that those pieces, that they don't exactly line up to make a perfect puzzle piece fit like they claim. Because in order to believe that the Burke did it theory, you would also have to believe, again, that John and Patsy, as JonBenèt's parents, came into a scene when Burke had done something to JonBenèt, and that these parents saw their daughter, who wasn't even dead yet, and that they decided to just finish her off with a garrote, and then spin it and twist it and sexually assault her and make it even more disturbing. And you would have to believe that they staged her body, wrote this long-ass ransom note. You'd also have to believe that they did all of that without either of her parents ever stopping to check for a pulse or a heartbeat or even trying to provide life-saving measures. You would have to believe all of that in order to get behind this theory that Burke murdered JonBenèt. I mean, come on now, Burke's weird, sure, but we would all be a little bit weird if we'd been accused for almost our entire lives of murdering our little sister. I just know it. We'd all be super weird. And the only thing that has ever not lined up with Burke, as far as what I can recall, is that Burke tells people during interviews when he was a kid that he was awake and that he heard his mom going psycho. But then it's weird just because John and Patsy are always so adamant that Burke was asleep throughout the entire morning until he was woken up and taken to their friend's house. But that's really the only major inconsistency that there is. Everything else is pretty speculative. Okay, so we've gone over the most common Patsy did it theory and the most common Burke did it theory. And that's, like I said, those are just the most common. There are tons and tons and tons of other theories by other people. These are just the most commonly talked about. And I am going to go over the most common John did it theory, but I found a thread on Reddit, and baby, when I tell you I went down a rabbit hole, I mean that in the most literal way. So I want to go over another common suspect and the theory that goes along with that before I get into the John did it theory. And again, as a reminder, all of these theories are just that. They are theories. This is all alleged and supposedly, and by no means am I saying that these are facts or that this is what I believe. And for legal reasons, these are all theories that I found while I scoured the internet, and I'm now just relaying them back to you. That is it, nothing more, nothing less. Now, I may remind you a few more times throughout this episode that these are theories because your girl can't handle a lawsuit at the moment. So, with that out of the way, I do want to go over the Santa did it theory before we get into John. So, the Ramseys always did their annual Christmas party, and for 3 years in a row, Bill McReynolds was the one who played Santa at these parties. Now, I've read that JonBenèt gave Bill McReynolds a tour of the Ramseys' massive house in 1995 during this Ramsey annual Christmas party. And Bill didn't just dress up as Santa only for the Ramseys during their Christmas party. This was something that Bill would do often for a lot of people. He enjoyed being the kind of magic that only Santa can bring for kids. So he did this for quite a few people. And there's a few reasons why people think old Santa Bill is on the suspect list. And I didn't realize it until now. I referred to him as Santa Bill in literally the rest of my notes. We're going to roll with it. So, for starters, he did get a tour of the house from JonBenèt. So, he would have known how to move about the house without making noise or causing a scene. He would have also known exactly where JonBenèt's bedroom was. And she would have been comfortable being alone with him because, duh, he's Santa. So, Bill McReynolds didn't just strap on a cheap dollar store beard. He looked like Santa all year long. So, JonBenèt would have only known him as Santa. And that's not the only reason why Santa Bill keeps making the suspect list in the eyes of the public, because Santa Bill's middle daughter was actually kidnapped as well. Santa Bill's daughter was kidnapped with a friend, and his daughter was forced to watch her friend get sexually assaulted. That's according to the Daily Camera. And things get a little more coincidental than that, though, because Santa Bill's daughter's kidnapping also took place on December 26th, but in 1974. So the same exact date that JonBenèt was reported missing and then later found in the basement, the same date, just years apart. That's kind of a coincidence. Another coincidence, though, is that Bill's wife wrote a play in 1976 that actually ended up winning some awards, so it must have been pretty good. Now, of course, this play was in 1976, and that was long before JonBenèt's murder. But this play is all about a girl who is sexually abused, tortured, and beaten to death in the basement of a house in Indiana. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. That play was based on the 1965 case of Sylvia Likens, which is a case we've already covered on the podcast before. So, of course, there are some similarities to JonBenèt's death, but they're all very basic. Like, nothing is so specific that it would make you go, yup, had to be Santa and his wife. And the play that Santa Bill's wife wrote, being similar to JonBenèt's death, doesn't seem like such a coincidence when you realize that it is based on the Sylvia Likens case. So it's not like Santa Bill's wife was taking JonBenèt's case and using it for inspiration for her play, because her play was written decades before JonBenèt's death ever even happened. But that didn't stop the Ramseys from naming Santa Bill as a suspect in their book, although the police had never named them as a suspect. Because Santa Bill and his wife both gave DNA samples and handwriting samples, and they were both able to be ruled out by Boulder police. And it does seem to really bother some people that JonBenèt and Santa Bill shared such a close bond. Most of it seems innocent and normal, but I'm not going to lie to you, some of it's a little weird. Santa said about JonBenèt, quote, "She had an angel spirit, which is unusual in not only adults, but children, and I'm devastated that she's gone." Santa Bill also recalls that at one of the Ramsey's Christmas parties, that JonBenèt had brought him a gift, and he said that out of all the times and all the different places that he had played Santa, that JonBenèt was the only child that had ever given him a gift. Normally, Santa's the gift giver, not the gift receiver. So you can kind of tell just by this short story the kind of heart that JonBenèt had. And I believe it was the year before the Christmas that JonBenèt passed away that Santa Bill was given a vial of what he called stardust by JonBenèt. And the stardust was just glitter, we know that now, and Santa Bill kept this vial of stardust on him, and he carried it around with him every day after that. And then after JonBenèt's death, Santa Bill still carried that vial of stardust around with him everywhere that he went. He even took it with him when he was going in to have a pretty major surgery. Now, it's a little bit weird that Santa Bill even admits to having a bond with JonBenèt where he felt closer to her than he did to any of his own kids or even his own grandkids. That's one of those things that's a little bit weird to me. But what's even weirder than that to me is that Santa Bill went so far as to ask his wife to mix his ashes from his cremation when he passed away, to mix it with the stardust that JonBenèt had gifted him. Like I said, that's a little weird. He asked his wife to mix the stardust with his own ashes and then spread the stardust and ashes behind a cabin that they owned. Now, Bill passed away in 2014, and I didn't even think to check to see if his wife actually did mix the stardust with the ashes or not. But regardless, one more thing I want to mention about Santa Bill is that he told JonBenèt that he was going to pay her a special visit after Christmas. And JonBenèt ended up telling somebody about this special visit from Santa. It was on December 24th, 1995. That was the day before she was found murdered. JonBenèt was playing at a friend's house. This friend was Megan Kosnick, and while JonBenèt was over at Megan's house playing, she tells Megan's mom, Barbara, that Santa is going to come and see her and pay her a special visit, which is a very normal thing for a 6-year-old to say on Christmas Eve. So Santa's mom, Barbara, tells JonBenèt that Santa's going to be seeing a lot of kids later that night. JonBenèt tells her friend's mom that this is going to be a secret visit from Santa, and that Santa was going to come and see her for this secret visit after Christmas. And this leads a lot of people to assume that JonBenèt could have been talking about Bill McReynolds being the one that was supposed to be coming for a secret visit. I believe that Santa Bill had even given JonBenèt a card on the day of the Ramsey's Christmas party that basically said the same thing, that he would see her for his after Christmas visit and that he would have a special gift for her. Sir, that's a little bit weird. Now, one more thing that I wanted to touch on about this Santa theory is that Santa Bill's wife was a movie critic for at least 10 years with the Boulder Daily Camera, and a movie critic would know a lot of lines from a lot of movies. All I'm saying is that there were a lot of movie references and a lot of theatrical lines going on in that ransom note, and I'm just going to leave that there for y'all to chew on while we continue to the JonBenèt theory. So, one of the commonly believed theories on John Ramsey being the murderer are based on a good bit of speculation that John Ramsey was molesting or sexually abusing JonBenèt, and that something happened where things were taken too far, and maybe he didn't have a choice but to kill his daughter. There's a whole theory that I'm actually going to post below so that y'all can go read the whole thing if you want to, and I would suggest doing that because it's intense. But this theory goes that John laid JonBenèt down for bed, and then he waited until everyone else in the house went to sleep, and that once everyone was asleep, he went in to wake JonBenèt up to sexually abuse her. That she possibly started bleeding vaginally, and that John got scared and decided right then that he was going to have to kill his daughter. And the theory from here goes that John would have taken JonBenèt into the kitchen for her favorite midnight snack, hence pineapples and milk. He would have left JonBenèt eating the pineapples and milk while he gathered supplies to kill his daughter. Now, from here, he would lure her down into the basement, and that's when the murder would happen. This theory is laid out in a way that makes you want to keep reading it, and it all kind of clicks until you see how many hoops and leaps you have to jump through to make this conclusion and make this theory work at all. But it's definitely worth a read. It's super interesting. It's laid out pretty intricately. It explains a lot of things that aren't really explainable. But you also have to step back and look at it from a perspective of, how did we get from here to here? How do we know that John was sexually abusing JonBenèt? There are a multitude of other people who had access to this child that could have very well been the one sexually abusing her, and it may not have been her dad. So I'm going to link it below because it is interesting. But other reasons that people point to John is the fact that John and Fleet White started their search in the basement instead of on the top level of the house, when Detective Linda Arndt specifically asked them to search the house top to bottom. Instead, they started bottom to top. And I don't think this is anything more than two men searching the entire house. They shouldn't have been the ones searching the house to start with, so we can leave that there. Of course, it's another big thing that people point to and say that John said, "Oh my God," before Fleet White remembers that the light switch was even on. And we've been over this. There were tests and experiments done that claimed that you couldn't see inside of the wine cellar without that light being on. But I think that would have a lot to do with each person's eyesight and how quickly or slowly their eyes adjust from light to dark, and like a whole slew of other things. So take that how you will. People think the way that John carried JonBenèt up the basement steps to the top level of the house where everybody else was at, they say that was weird because he was kind of holding her further away from his body than what seems natural. And they say that he was doing this because he knew that she was already dead because he was the one who killed her. And to that I say, none of us were there, and the people that were there were all going through like hella trauma together. So how would we know how he did or didn't carry the body up the stairs? But people think that everything in this case is weird. They think it's weird that he called his pilot, and that it's weird that he was going through the mail, and that it's weird that he pulled the duct tape off of JonBenèt's mouth when he found her. Which, by the way, is just the most parental thing that I can think of, is to not want to see your child in that position. So that doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what theory you go with. You will always have a gap in your theory, and it will never make perfect sense, and you cannot convince me otherwise. So we've covered a lot of the main theories and suspects in this case, and I realize that there are tons and tons and tons of other suspects and probably millions of other theories, and I just wanted to cover the main ones. Because if I covered all the suspects and all the theories, then this entire podcast would just be about the JonBenèt Ramsey case and nothing else. Because that's how many suspects and theories there are. I would never run out of things to find. So I want to get into the email that I got from a listener, and we're going to call this listener Dr. L. She's a badass and also a pathologist. Though she was very clear that she's not a forensic pathologist. But when I tell y'all she knocked my socks off, I mean that in the most literal way. So let's get into it. Because I actually want to read to y'all parts of the very first email that I got from Dr. L and why I was immediately intrigued. This will probably also help you get a better understanding of what we're about to go into. Because I opened my email, and one of the first things I read is this. John Douglas, the Mindhunter, said in his book that the worst thing that could happen to a person would be to have their child murdered and then be blamed for it. If this is what JonBenèt Ramsey's murderer did, it was the most successful murder for revenge of all time. It also explains the most enigmatic parts of this case, as this murder would have left clues to implicate the parents. including the crazy ransom note, using materials in the house, and making the murder scene look staged. And when I tell you I was immediately interested in what this woman had to say, I mean that wholeheartedly. And we've emailed back and forth a few times. Girl, I always forget to check my email. It's not you, it's me. Please don't break up with me. Okay. We've emailed back and forth a few times, and Dr. L also mentioned things that I've never heard of. Even though I was always on the family did it wagon, Dr. L mentioned that the police found the practice ransom note before JonBenèt's body was ever discovered, and that this probably likely convinced the police that the family was involved. Another thing Dr. L added was just to comment on John and Patsy's behavior, which is so often used against them. The police had found the practice note in Patsy's notebook before JonBenèt's body had been found, and this probably convinced them the family was involved. It's not ever mentioned, but is very telling to me that the police had no plan in place should a kidnapper call beyond taping the phone. If someone had called and demanded that John jump in his car and drive to meet them, they had no plans to tell his car or be able to trace it. John had no instructions on what he should do or say. Clearly, the police had already decided that there were no kidnappers. So essentially, this theory goes that there was basically some evil genius shit at work to make this case happen. Someone that knew and hated John and or Patsy plotted to carry out this murder with the hopes that the parents would look as guilty as possible. All while this evil genius would know themselves that John and Patsy were innocent. It definitely gets interesting, and it's definitely worth looking into. Dr. L also mentioned that the podcast The Consultant, The Real FBI Profilers, did a 2-part episode just analyzing the ransom note. And what they found was that the author of this ransom note was a sadistic person who had some kind of business connection to John Ramsey, but also someone who hated John Ramsey. They also point to the fact that by leaving this ransom note, that this would have given John and Patsy, who are innocent in this theory, but leaving the ransom note would have given John and Patsy this hope that they would eventually get their daughter back if they followed the directions of the ransom note. Which kind of makes it exceptionally cruel that they would give them false hope on purpose of getting their daughter back, knowing that they would eventually find her dead body in their own basement. Now, the file that she attached to this email literally looks like she did a dissertation on JonBenèt Ramsey and this case. There's no way I will be able to do all of this justice or even cover everything in this file that she sent. But I will go over some of the main points that kind of had me scratching my own head, and then I will try to get permission to share it, because if that's the case, then I can just link it on social media, and you can read it all, and we can talk about it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. So, for this theory of revenge against John Ramsey, the plan would have been, allegedly, to kill one of John's children in order to frame John and his wife Patsy. JonBenèt would have been the chosen child because she was the most vulnerable and because her bedroom was actually located on the opposite side of the house from where John, Patsy, and Burke would have been sleeping. From here it says, because there would be no physical evidence, as in fingerprints or DNA, on a murder weapon, the intruder devised ways to provide incriminating circumstantial evidence by leaving things like the ransom note and using materials from the house to make it look like the strangulation and the murder scene was all staged. Now, Dr. L then goes into detail about why this theory explains unusual features in this case that are usually unexplainable. Again, for example, the ransom note, using materials from the house, and leaving no evidence of entering or exiting the house. And she says that the ransom note would have been credible enough to be taken seriously at first, and it had all of the basic features of a regular ransom note. It says the child's been taken, money has been requested, threats have been made if authorities are contacted, and they even set a time for the kidnappers to supposedly call. Only for this person to not call on purpose. And then how weird it is for the ransom note to have all of these like theatrical movie quotes and for it to be 2.5 pages long. And then include all these weird things like we've been talking about. This carry an adequate sized acheté to the bank. be well rested, use your good Southern common sense. These would all make sense if you were trying to frame it to look like the parents were guilty. Because if the parents had written this ransom note, they probably would have been doing the absolute most, just like this theory suggests that the actual murderer would have done to make the Ramseys look guilty. Dr. L even lays out the fact that the intruder would have likely had samples of Patsy's handwriting laying around, like within the house, which I feel like then in turn would have made it harder for analysts and handwriting experts to say for sure yes or no, is this Patsy's handwriting, which is actually what has happened in this case. They've not been able to say yes or no definitively either way if they think it's Patsy's handwriting or not. And the theory that Dr. L has laid out for me explains that the intruder likely would have brought everything with them to commit the crime, and then found things throughout the house that they could use as they went along with their crime. For instance, they probably had pen and paper with them to write the ransom note if they didn't bring it with them already. But once you find pen and pad in the house, then why not use it there if your entire goal is to make John and Patsy look guilty? You would obviously want to use things found around their house. This theory also suggests that the practice notes that were found before JonBenèt's body was found were placed there on purpose to make it look as if John or Patsy had, pre-written this ransom note before they actually called police. So the practice notes would have been strategically placed to be found in order to make John and Patsy look guilty. This theory that Dr. L has laid out would also explain the two causes of death, the strangulation and the blow to the head. And it says, quote, "The original plot was likely to stage the strangulation after JonBenèt was dead. The strangulation would have occurred post-mortem, and that would have been revealed by an autopsy. This would have made it obvious that this was staged and thus very unlikely an act of an intruder whose intent was to kidnap JonBenèt." So it's laid out like maybe this intruder didn't realize that the blow to the head didn't kill JonBenèt, and then they were kind of forced to strangle her. As it gets further into how this intruder got into the house, it says that in this theory, the intruder would not want there to be an identifiable entry or exit point to the house. The Ramseys stated that multiple house keys were in the hands of non-family members, including people working on or in the house. So is it possible that the intruder obtained a key or had a key long enough to make their own copy and then easily gained access whenever? It also says that it's been stated that there was a hidden key under a statue for emergencies in case they locked themselves out. So if the intruder didn't have a key, then the broken basement in the window that John himself says he's gotten in and out of before would have likely been the next entry point. It's also been said that there were unlocked windows in the house because the Christmas cords the lights to the Christmas cords were running through them. And for this theory to work, for it to be somebody that knows and hates John Ramsey, it would have to be somebody that knows enough about them to know that the family used the spiral staircase in the back of the house to come down from their bedroom versus the main entrance in the foyer at the front of the house. And as far as what the intruder did once they got into the house, this part kind of links in with the part of Lou Smith's theory, which is the detective that the Ramseys hired to help them on this case. Because the Ramseys and Lou Smith believe that this was definitely an intruder. So Lou Smith and this theory that this was a revenge-filled kind of genius plan to frame John and Patsy Ramsey, both of those theories kind of work off of the idea that the intruder somehow got into the house. Whatever you believe, however they got into the house, they got into the house. They were able to hide in a bedroom that wasn't used regularly, for example, John's older kids, and they lay there and wait until everybody went to bed, which is why nobody heard them enter or exit the house. Something else that lines up with both Lou Smith's theory and the theory that Dr. L sent is that this intruder would have had to have been wearing gloves. That would explain why there's no other DNA found. And it doesn't matter which theory you believe, I've always wondered if the unknown male DNA didn't come from whoever handled these gloves, like from the store where they were bought, before whoever killed JonBenèt had them. For example, let's say I work at a hardware store and I'm restocking gloves. Somebody walks in, they grab a pair that I've just hung up. So now my DNA and their DNA would likely be on that same set of gloves. And I pulled very small, very, very small portions of this, file that I got attached to this email, just because I'm not sure if I can share the entire thing. I know I was given permission to talk about it and to use her name, but I almost want to just go through and read the entire thing to you, but I also don't want to get sued. So I'm going to reach out to her and see if I can share it, like the file on social media, and I'll post it for everybody. Because it makes a lot of sense, and it fills in a lot of gaps and a lot of holes that aren't normally able to be filled in with any other theory. Now, after JonBenèt's death, Jon Ramsey warned parents to be mindful of what ways their kids could possibly be being exposed to pedophiles. He says that he realizes how naive he and Patsy were with having JonBenèt in pageants where anyone can walk into this audience for any reason at all. He said that he didn't think that it was a good idea to have your children be put on display, and he even acknowledges that pageants could have potentially played a role in why JonBenèt was murdered. And something else that I just thought of is that if you're in the John or Patsy did it camp, then here's something to ponder. The Ramseys and the McReynolds, or aka Santa Bill, they were friends. So obviously the Ramseys would be familiar with Santa Bill's wife's play. That play could have possibly been the Ramseys' inspiration to write the ransom note and come up with the whole kidnapping thing to begin with. Allegedly. Now, I know I didn't touch on the theory that says that Fleet White killed JonBenèt, and that's just one that I don't find much credence to support, besides the fact that John and Patsy named Fleet as someone that they suspected in their book. And of course, after this murder, the Whites and the Ramseys were no longer friends, so, I just left that entire theory out. But I'll leave you on this thought. If it had been either John, Patsy, or both of them that murdered JonBenèt, then they would have had ample amount of time to come up with a better story than we came home from the Whites' Christmas party, went to bed, and woke up to this long-ass ransom note. Hell, they could have even said that they both saw an intruder and that that's what scared the intruder off. And that they didn't know that JonBenèt was still in the house. I feel like something as simple as that would have worked, but they didn't. They could have come up with a reason for the pineapple and milk sitting on the counter. They could have come up with any number of reasons for any of these unanswered questions that we still have, and they didn't. Now, again, before I sign off, I do want to mention that none of these theories are believed by me. They are all alleged allegations based on pure speculation and just stuff I found on the internet. Please don't sue me. I also saw where they're about to try to do more testing in 2024 for this case, so I'm excited to see what that turns up. I will keep y'all posted on any updates that we have on this case, and if I'm allowed to, I will. If I can do it like today or tomorrow and go ahead and put it out. But if I'm allowed to, I'll go through and read that entire Dr. L theory just word for word for you, because it is that interesting. But if I'm not allowed to do that, then this will be the last JonBenèt episode that we do until we get an update in this case. And that means it's time for a review of the week, because that means I'm about ready to sign off here. This review comes from Biscuits and Sunflowers. It says, "Oh my God, 5 stars. Literally the best podcast for me when it comes to true crime. She's amazing. Funny at the appropriate times, but still takes the cases seriously. Gets the point across in an enjoyable way. I highly recommend." Thank you so much. That was so nice. Biscuits and Sunflowers, I love you so much. Thank you. That's going to be all for me, so let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.